This is the story of a man who comes home to help run his family's farm, but soon madness turns them all into the witch diggers. Frank Rose, a young local man, visited a neighbor one night. Frank headed back home at midnight, but had to go by a rocky ravine on the way. As he approached the ravine, he heard a frightening sound. When he turned to his right to locate the source, he spotted a figure on the top of the hill nearby. This figure was hiding and keeping to the shadows while walking in an odd way. This figure carried something that shined bright at night. It began to approach Frank ever so slowly. That's when Frank decided to hide in a bush close by. The mysterious being approached within 10 feet of Frank, and then sprung up onto a tall rock with an unnatural athleticism. The figure in question was human-like, a wild-looking man. Suddenly, the strange creature took off into the night. Frank, understandably shaken up, returned home and told his story to those who would listen. He further described the creature as a muscular, wild-looking man with bright, burning eyes and long, matted hair. Hair not only on his head, but all over his body. The creature walked on all fours and carried a shiny metal tool with him. Frank's story divided the locals. Those who didn't believe shut down any talk of a strange creature. Those who were known to believe in the supernatural were scared enough to vow never to go back to the ravine, especially at night. Frank's story would be added to the next night by Henry Simon and William Downey. Henry and William were traders who were traveling back through the same ravine Frank had seen the strange creature at night when they heard loud smacks and bangs, like a metal tool crashing against rock. They tied their horses to a tree and walked up to the ravine, where they found a giant hole that had been dug by human hands. 20 feet below in the darkness, someone was striking the ground with a sledgehammer. They asked whoever was at the bottom of this hole what was going on, and the response was a rock flying towards them from the bottom of the hole. That's when they saw a hairy man jump out of the hole and run away into the night. The duo left in a hurry. Their story spread quickly, which led to them learning about a local legend. The local legend was that of a man who was called the Witch Digger. The locals now believed that Frank, Henry, and William had seen the ghost of the Witch Digger. To understand the Witch Digger's legend, we must first start with the Bischler family, a group of hardworking farmers with 3 sons. The parents came from Switzerland years ago and had originally settled in Damascus, Ohio, near the Appalachian Mountains. The Bischler family knew one thing, and that was hard work. They had turned their land into a successful farm by simply working hard. When the Civil War broke out, the 3 sons went to fight for the Union, but only one of them returned alive, Nick Bischler. Soon enough, Nick became the protector of the farm and his other siblings, as his parents died some years later. The only surviving family members left were Nick, who was the oldest, Susan, one of the middle children, and Sammy, the youngest child. Nick, by all accounts, was a normal man. Susan was a woman with an unfortunate build, and she was never destined to be married. Sammy seemed to be mentally challenged, so both Susan and Sammy would be dependent on Nick for the rest of their lives. A few years later, Nick sold the family farm and found another piece of land of 40 acres, filled with stones and ravines and chasms. Nick believed, though, that he and his 2 siblings could make this place work through some more Bischler hard work. Nick was a good-looking middle-aged man, with a mustache that made him attractive to the local women. but he seemed content to simply work on the farm and never cared about finding a woman for himself. He seemed happy to live and work with his mentally challenged brother and his odd sister on the farm. Nearby to the Bischlers' new farm was the previously mentioned rocky ravine, an extremely dangerous place. The narrow valley never got any sun, and there were some awful rumors that surrounded the place. Rumors of evil in the ravine, as well as it being a hotspot for outlaws. While these rumors were unfounded, they were nonetheless repeated locally. Not long after they settled into their new life, the Bischlers, one by one, began experiencing a hallucination or a craze that would become infectious. It all started with Sammy, the youngest. One day, Sammy was left alone at home while Nick and Susan worked the land. Nick came back to Sammy crouched down under the bed and staring at one of the small windows in the bedroom. He had seen something terrible. Something had come in through the window, but Sammy never said who or what it was and what it did after. He would never stay alone in the house again. He also became weary of the nearby ravine and oftentimes simply wandered the family farm in a sort of daze. Months later, Susan arrived at a neighbor's home in a panic, with her eyes wide with excitement. Susan then whispered, "They've got Nick." The neighbor inquired, and Susan claimed that the witches had taken him. She said they climbed through the window like monkeys and took Nick and choked him. She said she threw something at them, and that's when the witches attacked her, so she ran to the neighbor for help. Susan was still talking about the witches when Nick came up behind her, grabbed her by the arm, and took her away without a word. The neighbor asked Nick about the witches Susan had seen, to which he replied that she was dreaming, and they continued on back to their house. Susan began telling more wild stories to her neighbors. She told them of the long-faced women who glided up to the windows to peer in, and the monkeys with human heads who turned the tables and chairs over in the kitchen. Also, she raved about the huge snakes that spit massive globs of venom at their house. She finished her tales by saying all of them were witches in disguise. When Susan would tell these stories, the neighbors would ask Nick why he didn't tell her these witches weren't real. Nick would respond by saying maybe she was right. As years passed, the family became more and more isolated. Susan sometimes would come by the neighbors and rant about those evil witches. Sammy wandered and never spoke again. Nick, who was keeping the family together, feared the witches himself. The burden of his siblings' visions hit him heavy. He avoided everyone who wasn't Susan or Sammy. Nick, during this time, had become unnaturally strong, and people say his eyes began to shine. He looked like a, quote, wild man. Not long after, a hunter was hiking near Rocky Ravine when he spotted two men digging in a giant hole. He then saw another woman watching the men work, but the hunter couldn't see what they were working on. The men were putting great effort into their digging. The hunter moved in and saw the big man was breaking up rocks while the other two carried them off. That's when the woman spotted the hunter and told him the witches were under the rocks. This became the sole purpose of the Bischler family. They hunted witches under rocks. They were always digging. They even abandoned their house to live in the holes they dug so they could keep digging and digging and digging. Nick not only became convinced that witches were there, but also demonic entities. While they were digging, their farm went to ruin. Their cattle died of starvation, and the horses as well. But instead of blaming themselves, the Bischlers always blamed the witches. The family even killed some of their cattle so that they wouldn't breed any more witches. Once, a hen wandered off into the ravine where the Bischlers were digging, and the family slaughtered it and hung it up to keep the witches away. It wasn't long before the Bischlers began attacking any and all local wildlife in the valley. Susan would gather switches to attack butterflies, bugs, birds, and anything else they thought was a witch. When they successfully killed a witch, they would dance and sing around its corpse. They even kept multiple trophies from the carcasses of the so-called dead witches. The hunter who had spotted the Bischlers then went back to town to tell his story. That's when the townfolk started coming to the ravine to watch the Bischlers dig. They watched them dig until they were exhausted from doing so. The townspeople were amused and never tried to help them or get them help. At one point, there were thousands of people watching them dig for witches, and the family ignored them all. Eventually, the brothers reached the water table, where they kept digging into wet mud with clothes that were no more than rotting rags. They worked so long that their clothes disintegrated and that the brothers were left working in their underwear. If they never found any real witches, why would they continue to dig? Well, according to the family, they found a witch under every rock, in the form of a bug or some other organism. Again, they would celebrate each witch kill. Soon after the family became a town spectacle, a local lawyer brought the police and had them arrested and placed in a mental facility. By this time, Nick looked like a skeleton, weighing only 80 pounds. Nick was placed in the local insane asylum, while Susan and Sammy were placed in the local poor farm together. But Nick wouldn't stay there long, as he escaped only after a few hours. He was never seen again. Now, is the wild man that Frank Rose and the two traders saw those nights in the ravine in fact Nick Bischler? Is Nick's ghost still digging in that rocky ravine?